Jordan Ellis boarded the plane quietly, wearing a dark hoodie, clean sneakers, and neat jeans. With a first-class ticket in hand, he found his seat by the window where he always liked to sit. No one paid attention to him, not even the flight attendant, until she stopped, stared, and asked him to leave the seat. In front of the other passengers, Diane Carter accused Jordan of cheating, then suddenly slapped the back of his hand, forcing him to move to the economy class section. No, passengers spoke up. No one dared intervene. Jordan didn't argue, didn't make a scene. He simply picked up his phone and made a single call. Just a few minutes later, the flight was delayed. The crew members began to panic. Diane Carter, who still thought she had control over the entire cabin, gradually realized she had insulted the wrong person. What happened next shocked the entire plane, and it changed her life forever, even before the wheels of the aircraft had lifted from the ground. Jordan Ellis walked onto the plane quietly. He wore a small, sleek black headset around his neck, and in his hand he held a slim black phone. At the age of 17, Jordan was calm and collected, raised not to draw attention to himself. He walked down the first-class aisle, confidently, but not arrogantly. He didn't show off, didn't make a fuss. He simply sat down in the seat assigned to him on his ticket. Jordan gently placed his backpack in the overhead compartment, then sat down and pulled out a book. A few passengers glanced at him and quickly turned away. To them, he was just a kid, traveling alone, nothing special. Jordan didn't mind. He was used to being ignored. A moment later, Diane Carter, the flight attendant in her 40s, entered the first-class cabin. Her uniform was pressed, and her hair was neatly styled in a high bun. Diane walked decisively down the aisle, occasionally flashing professional smiles at other passengers. But when her gaze met Jordan's, her smile disappeared. She stopped her eyes, scanning the young man from head to toe. No greeting, no friendliness. She tilted her head, her voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Excuse me, are you sure you're sitting in the right seat?" Jordan looked up slightly surprised. "Yes, ma'am." Diane crossed her arms, signaling, "Let me see your ticket." Jordan pulled his ticket from the pocket of his hoodie and handed it to her. Diane snatched the ticket without a word. Her eyes narrowed as she checked it, then glanced quickly between the ticket and Jordan's face, then back at the ticket. "This is a first-class ticket," she slowly emphasized. "I know," Jordan replied calmly. Diane paused for a few seconds. "Are you traveling alone?" Jordan nodded slightly. He knew the conversation wouldn't stop there. Diane lowered her voice, colder now. "There must be some mistake. This seat is for actual first-class passengers." Only Jordan felt a tightness in his chest. "I am a first-class passenger," he said flatly. Diane's tone became sharper. "You're delaying the boarding process. I don't know where you got this ticket, but you better move to the back section now." Jordan remained seated, his voice unchanged. "This is my seat." Diane's face hardened. She snapped, "Stand up." When Jordan didn't immediately respond, Diane reached for the phone resting on his armrest, and either by accident or design, her hand struck Jordan's knuckles, making a loud slap echo throughout the cabin. Some nearby passengers gasped in stunned silence. A woman covered her mouth. A man glanced at his watch to avoid eye contact, but no one intervened. Jordan simply looked at Diane for a few seconds, not because of the pain, but because he couldn't believe it. He stood up, still silent. No resistance. He quietly grabbed his backpack, pulled the hood over his head, and walked down the aisle under the gaze of the entire cabin. He found an empty seat in the last row where the seats were smaller, tighter, and the armrest was loose. Jordan didn't care. He sat down, placed his phone in his lap, and took a deep breath. A message vibrated in his hand. Jordan unlocked his phone and typed a single line. She slapped my hand and made me move down. "Now I'm sitting at the back of the plane," he pressed. Jordan turned to look out the window. The runway outside stretched on unchanged, but inside he knew everything had changed, and this was just the beginning. He sat still, his eyes glued to the scratched window. The engine hummed steadily, almost lulling him to sleep, but Jordan's chest still ached with quiet rage. The kind of anger that didn't shout, but waited for the right moment. He gripped his phone tightly in his hand. The message had been sent almost 2 minutes ago, but there was no reply. Jordan wasn't worried. He knew when that message was received, everything would begin. In a tall building miles away, a phone rang. The man behind the desk. Broad-shouldered, salt-and-pepper hair, and a dark blue suit worth more than most middle-class cars, read the message without saying a word. This was Samuel Ellis Jordan's father, a tech billionaire, the owner of many major corporations, and most importantly, the largest shareholder of Global Skyways, the airline Jordan was flying with on Flight 917. Samuel Ellis said nothing. He didn't slam his hand on the desk or raise his voice. He simply picked up the desk phone and dialed the number he had memorized long ago. The phone beeped twice before a voice on the other end of the line responded, "Hello, sir." Samuel calmly issued his command Flight 917. "I want an immediate report, Seat 2A. "There's been an incident." The voice on the other end didn't hesitate. "Understood." Sir Samuel hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair. In his eyes, a quiet fury was beginning to form. Meanwhile, on the plane, Diane Carter returned to the galley, still feeling smug. She quickly poured herself a cup of coffee, leaned against the counter, and flashed a victorious smile. In Diane's eyes, the young man was just a troublemaker. In today's world, everyone thought that if you had money, you could sit in first class. The way he dressed his silence, it all made her feel like something was off, and she didn't feel guilty in the slightest. A younger flight attendant wearing a name tag that read Maya Reynolds walked up and hesitantly asked in a quiet voice, Diane was there. Really an issue with his ticket. Diane Carter rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed. "Did you see him? Does he look like someone who belongs in first class?" Maya Reynolds furrowed her brow, but still whispered, "But I checked the ticket is legitimate." Diane let out a dismissive laugh. Maybe he borrowed it from someone else. She shook her head, dropping a cold remark. "We can't let things like that happen in first class. It ruins the image of the flight." Maya fell silent, unsure how to respond. Suddenly, the intercom buzzed through the cabin speakers. "Diane Carter, please report to the cockpit. Diane's coffee cup froze in midair." She blinked. Maya, too, looked on with a hint of surprise. "What's going on?" Maya asked Diane, forced to smile. Probably just a routine check. But deep down, a sense of unease began to flicker inside her. Diane set the cup down, adjusted her uniform, and walked toward the front. As she passed the rows of seats, she could feel the passengers' gazes on her, some whispering to one another. She held her head high, trying to maintain her composure. The cockpit door was already open by the time Diane arrived. Captain Logan Price, a seasoned pilot with over 30 years of experience, stood there. His expression was cold. "Close the door," he commanded. Diane did as instructed, and the sound of the door closing was like a signal that everything had changed. The atmosphere in the cockpit was so heavy that Diane could almost feel every breath she took. Captain Logan Price stood with his arms crossed, his icy gaze locking onto Diane. On the small screen next to the radio system, the face of a man appeared. Diane didn't recognize him, but his voice made her freeze. "I'm Anthony Reed, the Director of Flight Operations," he introduced briefly. "We've received a report from the Senior Operations Department about an issue with the passenger in Seat 2A. Diane froze in place. "Sir, it was just a seating mix-up. I've already handled it." Anthony Reed's voice grew sharper. "Did you check the ticket?" Diane hesitated. "I did check, but the ticket looked strange, and he wasn't on the list I received, so I thought—" "You thought?" Anthony interrupted, his tone chilling. "You made assumptions without confirming." Diane stammered. "The boarding process was a bit rushed, so I—" Captain Logan Price exchanged a stern look with Anthony through the screen, then turned to Diane. You didn't follow protocol. No report, no confirmation of the list. More importantly, you didn't recognize who the passenger was. Diane felt her stomach tighten. He's just a teenager, she mumbled. Anthony Reed cut her off, his voice icy. No, he's Jordan Ellis, Samuel Ellis's son. Diane's eyes widened. I didn't know. Now you do. Captain Logan Price concluded, his voice heavy. And we just received direct instructions from Samuel Ellis. This flight will not depart until the matter is resolved. Diane staggered back a step. The words echoed in her mind like the toll of a death knell. Anthony continued, we've halted all operations. You will personally apologize to Jordan Ellis in front of all the passengers and escort him back to his original seat. Diane whispered, unable to believe it. In front of everyone, Captain Logan Price nodded. You publicly humiliated him. Now, you must publicly correct your mistake. If not, don't expect to continue flying for global skyways. Diane opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. With no other option, Diane turned and opened the cockpit door. As soon as she stepped outside, she immediately felt the shift in the cabin. The air was thick with the weight of stairs. Passengers lowered their phones, and conversation ceased. Each step Diane took now felt heavier, as if her shoes were weighed down with lead. She was no longer in charge of the cabin. She had become the center of a silent storm. All eyes followed Diane as she walked down to the back of the plane where Jordan Ellis was waiting. Jordan Ellis sat quietly in the last row, his headphones wrapped around his neck, his phone loosely in hand, his gaze silently fixed on the window, as if nothing that had just happened concerned him. But Diane Carter could clearly see the tension in the young man's shoulders. He knew she stopped a few steps away from him and cleared her throat. Her voice this time lacked the sharpness it had earlier. Mr. Ellis, Diane began trying to sound polite. There was a misunderstanding. I'd like to invite you to return to your original seat in first class. Jordan didn't respond immediately. He let her words hang in the air. Nearby passengers began to turn their heads. A few even pulled out their phones. Diane repeated herself, her voice softer. I'm sorry for what happened earlier. I didn't handle it properly. Finally, Jordan turned his head. His face remained calm, but his eyes were sharp, as if weighing each word she said. A misunderstanding, you say? Jordan asked, his voice steady. Diane nodded quickly. Yes, I misjudged the situation. Jordan tilted his head slowly, asking again. You mean you misjudged me? Diane hesitated, her steps faltering, as if searching for a place to hide. I didn't mean anything personal, she stammered. Jordan kept his gaze steady, cutting her off. You looked at me and immediately decided I didn't belong there. You didn't check anyone else's ticket in the cabin. Diane opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jordan tightened the strap of his backpack and stood up. The passengers around him fell silent, sensing the tension in the air. I'll go back, Jordan said. But not because you allow it. Because that's my seat. Diane nodded stiffly and turned to lead the way. They walked back toward the front, passing rows of seats where passengers' gazes now carried an air of consideration. No one saw Jordan as just an ordinary kid anymore. They had seen the power in his silence. Jordan returned to seat 2A and sat down calmly. Diane stood silently beside him, unsure of what to do next. If you need anything. She mumbled, her voice almost devoid of confidence. Jordan didn't respond. He simply opened his book again, flipping to the page he had been reading, and buried himself in it as if she didn't exist. The conversation ended there. Diane turned slowly, her posture weighed down, and walked down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Her steps had lost the authority they once had. Her hands trembled as she reached for a plastic tray in the galley where Maya Reynolds stood quietly watching. Diane didn't dare look up at Maya. She pretended to be busy arranging cups, though her hands were so clumsy that she dropped a few. Are you okay? Maya asked softly, her voice full of concern. Diane didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the meaningless plastic cups, arranging them mechanically. "I've handled it," she finally muttered after a few sharp breaths, but her voice was as fragile as a glass cup on the verge of breaking. Maya didn't respond. The heavy silence between them spoke more than any words could. Diane Carter had once been the one who gave orders, the one who reminded everyone to follow procedure, the one who maintained a cold, unshakable demeanor. Now she was just a shadow of herself, burdened by the weight of the consequences. Up ahead, Jordan Ellis sat still in seat 2A. The book lay open before him, but his eyes no longer read the words. In his mind, the moments that had just passed replayed the slap, the averted gazes, the silence from everyone, the forced apology, and the strange shift in the atmosphere around him. The people who had once ignored him were now secretly watching, as if trying to understand how a quiet young man could shake up the entire first-class cabin with nothing but his presence. Jordan didn't respond to their stares. He didn't need to. He took out his phone and unlocked it. A new message from his father, "Samuel Ellis, stay calm. More people are watching than you think. The flight will take off, but on our terms." The corner of Jordan's mouth lifted slightly. Not a smile, just a sign of understanding. He typed back, "She apologized, but she still doesn't get it." The reply came swiftly, "She will understand." Before this flight ends. In the cockpit, Captain Logan Price still had one hand on the control panel and the other holding the intercom phone, speaking with the ground crew. His face remained calm and professional, but deep inside he felt uneasy. After all these years of piloting, he had never received an order to hold a flight from such high-level authorities as this Flight 917 was still at the gate. The plane's door hadn't closed yet. And now, whispers were beginning to spread throughout the crew like a wave. Some guessed that the flight would be delayed for hours. Others wondered who the young man in seat 2A was and how he had such power. In the economy section, a few passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident whispered to each other, "He's definitely important." They made the flight attendant apologize publicly. That's never happened. She slapped his hand. "I saw it with my own eyes." At first, she humiliated him, then pretended like nothing happened. "I should have spoken up." But they hadn't. And now that silence resonated louder than any words. Meanwhile, Diane Carter still stood frozen in the galley, gripping the edge of the tray, her breathing heavy. Her heart racing. She had followed the orders, had apologized, had escorted Jordan back to his rightful seat, but she didn't feel any lighter inside, because deep down, Diane knew the worst truth. This wasn't a random mistake. This was a choice. And now the consequences of that wrong choice were waiting for Diane Carter at 30,000 feet. The plane had finished boarding nearly 10 minutes ago, but it still hadn't begun to taxi down the runway. Passengers began shifting restlessly in their seats, peering out the windows, checking their watches. Some started murmuring about missed connections or fearing a delay in their schedules. The atmosphere in the cabin wasn't loud or chaotic, but it was thick with a quiet tension. Everyone could sense that something was wrong, even though no one knew exactly what. Jordan Ellis remained seated in 2A, his legs crossed, sitting calmly. But beneath that calm exterior, his mind was a stream of sharp thoughts flowing relentlessly. Every second that passed only deepened the memory of what had just occurred. It wasn't just being asked to leave his seat. It was the way she looked at him, as if he were a stranger, as if that seat belonged to someone else, someone different, someone who wasn't him. The slap wasn't the worst part. It was the humiliation that hurt the most. He picked up his phone. A new message appeared. "Dad has spoken with the board. The delay is intentional. You will get to your destination safely, but she won't be allowed to fly again today." Jordan read the message twice, then turned off the screen. 3 rows ahead, a middle-aged man in a gray sweater turned to look at Jordan. his eyes a mix of guilt and curiosity. He opened his mouth to say something, but then thought better of it. Jordan didn't care. He was used to that kind of hesitation. In the galley, Diane Carter paced back and forth, her steps short and tense. Her nerves felt like they might snap at any moment. The more she thought, the more she felt everything begin to collapse. Captain Logan Price's gaze, Anthony Reed's cold voice, the heavy silence from Maya Reynolds. Diane knew she hadn't just hurt a passenger. She had insulted the son of the man who could ruin her career with a single phone call. She leaned against the narrow wall, closing her eyes. 10 years in the air, Diane had handled all sorts of situations, but never had she paid the price for her rash judgments like this. She had once scrutinized passengers, turned down upgrades, moved people, because of her feelings that they didn't belong. No one had ever reacted this strongly. Until today, her chest tightened. Maya Reynolds' whisper shattered the silence. "They're waiting for you." Diane turned, her voice trembling. Who's waiting? A call. Maybe from the captain. Maybe from operations. But this isn't over. Diane didn't respond. She picked up the intercom phone with trembling hands, dialing the cockpit Diane Carter. Here, she reported Captain Logan Price's voice came slowly but firmly. "You need to prepare. We'll be removing you from the flight as soon as we return to the gate." Diane felt the ground beneath her feet crumble. "What you're saying? You're kicking me off." A silence. Then the captain replied, emotionless. "Orders from the highest level. The chairman requests it. A new crew member will replace you for this flight." Diane was stunned into silence. She stammered, "So what do I say to the passengers?" The captain answered calmly, "Nothing, they've already seen enough." Diane slowly hung up the phone, her hand still shaking. Maya Reynolds stood there, silent, her eyes neither accusatory nor comforting. In seat 2A, Jordan Ellis rested his head against the seatback, his eyes half closed, letting the silence stretch on. He let Diane feel what it was like to lose control in a space she once thought she owned. The plane hadn't taken off yet, but the collapse had already begun. Diane Carter stood frozen in the galley, her back pressed against the narrow wall, her heart pounding in her chest. Normally, Diane was the picture of control, confident, efficient, respected by her colleagues, but now all of that was just a memory. The sounds of seatbelt clicks, the rustle of magazines being hastily flipped, all of it now seemed like it came from another world. Diane Carter's world had shrunk to just this moment, this mistake. For years, she had convinced herself that instinct was what kept order, that judging who belonged in first class was for the greater good. But this time, she hadn't just guessed. She had acted publicly, and now Diane was the one being kicked off. Maya Reynolds quietly handed her a folded sheet of paper. Diane took it, her eyes filled with skepticism. It was the employee incident report. Maya whispered, "The ground crew is waiting. You have to sign before leaving the plane." Diane stared at Maya. Really, Maya didn't answer. It wasn't necessary. The cabin lights dimmed gently as the crew received the final instructions from the cockpit. Captain Logan Price's voice came over the intercom, calm but precise. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a crew change, our flight will be delayed a little while longer. Please remain in your seats. We will depart as soon as the adjustment is complete." The announcement sounded vague, deliberately withholding details, but it couldn't stop the wave of speculation from spreading throughout the cabin. Crew change, who's being replaced? What happened? All eyes slowly turned toward one place, the galley where Diane Carter stood like an outsider, in the very plane she once thought she controlled. Diane Carter felt the change acutely. The control that had once belonged to her now vanished before her eyes, slipping away with no chance of reclaiming it. She was no longer the one giving orders. She had become the lesson. With trembling hands, Diane signed the paper that Maya Reynolds had handed to her. Her signature once a symbol of experience and authority, now appeared painfully unfamiliar on the document confirming her removal from the flight. She adjusted her uniform one last time, straightening the folds of her shirt, and began walking toward the front of the plane. Each step felt like dragging the humiliation along the carpeted floor. The curtain separating first class had been pulled aside. The passengers sat in silence, all eyes immediately turning toward Diane. Some watched with curiosity. Others showed clear displeasure. And then there were those whose gazes were indifferent, as if witnessing a deserved consequence. They had seen how she treated Jordan Ellis. Now they were witnessing the price she had to pay. Jordan remained still in his seat, his headphones loosely resting on his lap, his gaze silently following Diane. Not a raised eyebrow, not a sarcastic smile, just silence. When Diane's eyes passed over Jordan, she suddenly saw something she had missed earlier. He wasn't just a teenager sent back to economy class. He was someone stronger than anyone in this cabin, not because of his money or family's power, but because he didn't need to shout to prove his worth. It was his silence that revealed everything. Diane gasped, but kept walking, passing the rows of seats where every gaze seemed to judge her through the billowing curtain and past the remnants of her career. The plane's door opened. On the jetway, a security officer in a dark blue uniform and a woman in a navy blazer clipboard in hand stood waiting. No one spoke as Diane crossed that threshold. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, as if sealing away everything from her past. Inside the cabin seemed to release its burden. Someone let out a sigh of relief. A businesswoman across from Jordan glanced at him with eyes that were completely different from before. A man sitting opposite Jordan leaned back in his seat, his expression a mix of regret and respect. Jordan tightened his seatbelt, picking up the book that was still open on his lap. He hadn't spoken a word since returning to his seat, but it was clear that he had completely changed the course of this flight. The plane's door clicked shut decisively, leaving behind a heavy silence in the cabin. It wasn't the quiet before takeoff. It was the silence of those who had just witnessed a truth they could no longer ignore. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. Clearly something had cracked. A few passengers subtly leaned forward, whispering quietly among themselves. Some sat up straighter, as if wanting to appear attentive. Their eyes were no longer focused on the entertainment screens or their phones. They were directed toward Jordan Ellis, the young man in seat 2A who had shifted the power dynamics on this flight simply with a quiet phone call. Jordan didn't move. He sat still, back straight, one hand resting on the book, the other absent-mindedly touching his phone. He didn't show anger. He didn't need to. He was focused, observing, and letting silence speak for him. From a young age, Jordan had learned that true power doesn't need to be loud. The more someone shouts, the more likely they're the weakest. The one who sits quietly waiting is the one who forces others to take notice. Maya Reynolds quietly pushed the beverage cart down the aisle. Her hands were steady, but her gaze was cautious as it swept over each passenger's face. She stopped beside Jordan. "Would you like something to drink?" Maya asked softly. Jordan looked up. "A glass of water, please." "Thank you." Maya nodded, handing him the small cup of water, her gaze lingering on him longer than usual before she continued with her duties. In that gaze, there was no pity, only respect. In the cockpit, Captain Logan Price checked the clock again. The delay had already stretched beyond 30 minutes, something no one wanted, but this time he knew no one had the right to complain. The orders had come from the highest level. And when someone like Samuel Ellis gives orders, no one in the company dares question them. "Is the replacement ready?" Captain asked over the intercom. "Ready, sir. The door will close in 5 seconds. The captain nodded and leaned back in his seat. In his long career navigating through storms, emergency landings, and political crises, he had never encountered a moment as strange as this. A quiet young man with his calmness had paralyzed an entire massive system. He adjusted the cabin system, then ordered the crew to prepare for takeoff. In first class, Jordan sipped his water, glancing at the reflection in the glass. The older man in the gray blazer across from him cleared his throat, as if searching for the courage to speak. I witnessed what happened, he said, his voice low and hesitant. That was wrong. Everything about it. Jordan didn't respond. The man swallowed hard, then continued. I should have spoken up earlier. But I didn't. Jordan looked at him calmly, asking, Why not? He fumbled for words. I wasn't sure it was my place, and I didn't think the situation would escalate like this. Jordan nodded, his eyes heavy. That's the problem. It doesn't begin with violence. It begins with silence. Those words hung between them heavier than any headwind outside. The man turned away, not angry, just filled with shame. Across the aisle, a woman who had once avoided Jordan's gaze was now quietly watching him. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were enough to express a late awakening. In the rear of the cabin, a few passengers in economy were replaying the incident on their phones, sharing it with one another through heavy glances. In the economy class, a passenger leaned toward the person next to them and whispered, Do you think this video will spread? The other replied with certainty. Definitely. It might already be online. It'll probably be sent to the press. No one laughed. No one mocked. They knew this had gone far beyond a typical argument. It had become a moment, a crack in the usual silence, something bigger than the flight itself. Something that touched the most sensitive nerves. Jordan Ellis's phone buzzed softly. A message from his father, Samuel Ellis. The video has been leaked. News outlets are starting to contact us. You've done what needed to be done. Now sit tight and let me handle the rest. Jordan read the message, then typed back, She's left the plane. But I'm not sure she understands why. A quick reply came, She will not, because we're punishing her, but because the whole world is watching now. At that moment, the final door of the plane closed. The engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi down the runway. Jordan remained silently seated in 2A in a first-class cabin where everyone couldn't stop thinking about him. Not because he was rich, not because of his family background, but because a quiet young man had changed everything without raising a hand or raising his voice. The plane accelerated, the engine's roar, vibrating through the cabin. The lights dimmed, signaling passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for takeoff. But in the hearts of the passengers, something still wasn't quite right. It wasn't the fear of flying. It was the awareness, a shared awareness that the ordinary things that used to be were now shattered. Everyone tried to appear normal, eyes fixed on books, magazines, or movies, but their gazes kept shifting surreptitiously toward seat 2A, where Jordan sat motionless, his head slightly tilted, eyes looking out the window. From the outside, Jordan seemed calm, perhaps even indifferent, but inside his mind was spinning relentlessly. Jordan had never liked attention. He didn't want to be the center of it. But after a year of witnessing too much, he knew that sometimes silence could be complicity, and this time he had refused to remain silent. The slap was just the surface. The real pain was the feeling of being told he didn't belong, the feeling that his presence here needed to be questioned. Jordan leaned his head against the window, watching the city lights fade into smudged yellow streaks as the plane lifted off the ground. The sound of the wheels lifting off the runway swept through the cabin like a reminder. Everything had changed. Maya Reynolds silently passed down the aisle, her voice soft and practiced as she offered drinks and snacks. When she reached Jordan's seat, she paused longer than usual. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked quietly. Jordan looked up politely, shaking his head. "No thanks, I'm fine." Maya nodded, and before walking away, leaned in a little closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You didn't deserve that, I just wanted to say that." Her voice was low enough that only Jordan could hear. He didn't smile, but his gaze softened a little. "Thanks," he replied. Maya smiled faintly, then continued on her way. Just a brief moment, but enough for Jordan to remember that not everyone chooses to remain silent. Some see it. And sometimes just recognizing it is the first step toward change. Across the aisle, the man in the gray blazer who had apologized earlier was now looking at his phone. The screen glowed with a prominent headline. Teen kicked out of first class turns out. He's the son of the airline's chairman. The article had been published less than 20 minutes ago. Just below the headline was a blurry photo taken during the confrontation between Diane Carter and Jordan in the cabin. Though the photo was unclear, the tension radiating from that moment was undeniable. Comments started flooding in. He's even calmer than I thought. This is why representation matters. She slapped him and still thought she was right. Unbelievable respect for how he kept his composure. A lot of people would have blown up by now. The man glanced at Jordan again, but this time his gaze wasn't filled with hesitation or confusion. It was quiet respect. Jordan Ellis had never said much. He hadn't demanded anyone do anything. He had simply maintained his dignity. And that was enough in the galley. Maya Reynolds was also reading the article on her device. She sighed, looking around. The other flight attendants whispered to each other, trying to avoid mentioning the incident, but it had consumed everyone's thoughts. Lauren Evans, another attendant, approached and asked softly, "Is she really going to be fired?" Maya stayed silent for a long moment before answering, "It's not in her hands anymore." They sank into silence once more. Back in first class, Jordan opened his book again, but this time he didn't read. The words blurred before his eyes as his mind drifted toward the days ahead. The article would spread, more people would see the video, his father would talk to the board. Maybe they'd make an official statement, but above all, something more important had happened. People had seen, not just the slap, not just the silence, but the change that began with one person daring to say, "Enough, and who knows next time." Maybe someone else will stand up before things go too far. Before another child is pushed to the back row, silently waiting for the world to awaken. The plane glided gently through the high skies, calm and steady. But inside the cabin, something stronger than turbulence stirred. It was the truth, and truth never lands in silence. At over 35,000 feet, the plane was balanced in the sky. A small bell rang, signaling to the passengers that they could unbuckle their seatbelts. The entire cabin began to relax, the soft clink of glasses on trays, headphones being put on, books being opened. But beneath that calm surface, an underground current still ran silently. Though they tried to appear calm, no one had completely forgotten what had happened. Earlier, Jordan Ellis remained seated in 2A, one leg crossed over the other, occasionally glancing out the window. Most of the time, he was still. His phone buzzed a few times in his pocket. 3 missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, and 4 unread emails, all marked urgent requests for comments, interview invitations. Surely his father, Samuel Ellis, had already passed the story to the legal team. The airline might be preparing a press release, but for Jordan, none of that mattered at this moment. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't seeking fame. What haunted Jordan the most was the look Diane Carter had given him when she realized who she had just mistreated, not because of the power behind the Ellis name, but because for the first time she had to see Jordan as a real person. That was what Diane hadn't anticipated, and that was what made the story even more bitter. Across from him, the man in the gray blazer kept opening his phone, scrolling through comments as if searching for an answer for himself. 2 rows ahead, a woman whispered to her friend, "They didn't even check his ticket. Can you believe that?" Her friend sighed. "I'm not surprised at all." In economy class, one of the passengers who had filmed the earlier chaos had just uploaded the video to social media. Within an hour, the view count had surpassed $20,000. In the clip, Diane Carter's voice was crystal clear. "You're delaying the boarding process." The sound of the slap echoed, followed by the deathly silence. Then, the image of Jordan Ellis, calmly standing up, grabbing his backpack, and walking away. What shocked viewers wasn't just the words, it was the way everyone around remained silent, the way their eyes avoided looking, the way the cabin fell into stillness, ignoring the injustice right in front of them. Comments began pouring in. This is what happens when the powerless fight back bet. She didn't think a kid in a hoodie could have that much impact. Walking back to the rear of the plane without making a fuss, that's truly impressive. In the cockpit, Captain Logan Price received a new notification through his headset. An internal airline memo had been sent down. The incident involving Flight 917 is under urgent investigation. All staff are required to remain silent with the press. Await further instructions, Logan wasn't surprised. He looked out at the wide, clear horizon. Though everything appeared calm on the surface, he knew for sure. This flight would be remembered long after it landed. In the galley, Maya Reynolds leaned lightly against the counter, quietly sipping water. She had been through chaotic flights, panicked moments mid-air, even emergency landings. But this was different. No noise, no chaos, just silence and a weight that no one could deny. Maya kept remembering the image of Jordan sitting still, needing no shouting, needing no demands, just existing. Sometimes truth doesn't need the spotlight, it just needs to be seen. Lauren Evans, a colleague, came over and whispered, "Do you think she'll resist?" Maya raised an eyebrow, replying, "Resist what? Suspension investigation, or the fact that her career's pretty much over now." Lauren sighed. "The hardest part is admitting you were wrong." Meanwhile, over at 2A, Jordan received another message from his father. HR has started an investigation. They need your statement, but leave it to me. You rest. This might become bigger than we thought. Jordan replied briefly, "Let it get big. Maybe that's the only way people will change." He put the phone away, crossed his arms, and leaned back in his seat. The beverage cart quietly passed by behind him, but Jordan didn't notice. His mind wasn't on soda or snacks. His mind returned to that moment, the moment Diane Carter looked at him, and in that instant decided that he didn't belong here. That prejudice had destroyed everything. Jordan didn't need to get angry. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He just needed to stay calm. And now the whole world was hearing him, by the way. They couldn't deny the truth anymore. The plane glided smoothly through the sky above the transparent layers of clouds. Jordan sat still like a statue, his quiet demeanor making even those who hadn't witnessed the incident feel uneasy. No one could focus on their books anymore. The movies playing on screens were left unfinished. The ice in glasses began to melt on trays, but no one bothered to drink. The man across the aisle opened and closed his tablet 3 times in 10 minutes. Occasionally, passengers' eyes would covertly shift toward Jordan, only to quickly look away when he slightly moved. No official announcements were made. No one spoke to acknowledge it, but each person on the flight felt it clearly. Something serious had happened, and its echoes still hung heavily above them. News travels quickly, even without Wi-Fi. In the economy class, a middle-aged woman opened the Twitter app on her phone. On the screen, the video of Jordan Ellis being pushed out of first class was trending. The comments flooded the newsfeed. People like her don't lose power often, but when they do, it's because they think no one is watching. He didn't scream. He didn't make a scene. He just quietly exposed the truth. You could feel the chill in the cabin when he silently walked to the back of the plane. In less than an hour, the video had surpassed 80,000 views. A reporter had tweeted asking for an interview. Another tagged the airline, demanding a public explanation. The internet, as always, had turned what was supposed to fade away into silence into a tidal wave. And that wave was just beginning. Jordan didn't need to look at the screen to know what was happening. Samuel Ellis had once told him, "The true power of silence is that it creates space for the truth to enter." And that was happening now. Jordan recalled the moment Diane Carter left the plane. No regrets, no panic. Just the gaze of someone who was finally forced to see herself in the mirror. A mirror not made of shouts, but of consequences. Maya Reynolds returned to the cabin, walking slowly toward Jordan. She said nothing at first, resting her hand lightly on the armrest of the seat opposite him, then whispered, "I'm sorry I should have spoken up sooner." Jordan looked up at her, his voice calm. "You don't have to fix it. You just need to see it." Maya nodded. "I saw it." She hesitated, then added, "People often hide behind uniforms, rules, ranks, but you didn't let that blind everyone." Jordan exhaled slowly. "Because I don't need to." Maya looked down at the row of seats where Diane once stood. Commanding now, in retrospect, it all felt like a day long ago. "Let me know if you need anything," Maya said softly before walking away. "Thanks," Jordan replied. The cabin fell into the heavy silence again. Jordan leaned his head against the window, closing his eyes, not to sleep, but to regulate his breathing, to find his calm again. Across the aisle, the man in the gray blazer hesitated, then finally leaned over toward Jordan. "Listen," he began, his voice low and raspy. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how I just sat there and watched." Jordan didn't open his eyes. He waited. "I think, for people like me, pretending not to see is always easier. But the truth is, I saw everything. I knew everything. And I didn't say a word." Jordan opened his eyes and looked directly at him. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice choking, "knowing and doing nothing, then feeling regret." It's not enough," Jordan responded calmly. "No, it's never enough." The man lowered his face, his fingers nervously twisting the hem of his pants. He wasn't the villain in this story, but he had been a witness. And sometimes silence can be as harmful as action. At the back of the plane, Maya leaned lightly against the wall, arms crossed. She had just received a call from the Crew Coordination Department. The official investigation had begun. Diane Carter was being questioned. The airline had opened a full review of passenger handling procedures. No one mentioned Diane by name, but everyone knew who it was. Maya took a deep breath. She had worked with Diane for 2 years. Diane had always been strict, sometimes cold, always the one giving orders, but Maya had also seen the small moments, those times when Diane decided who deserved a smile and who didn't, who got the welcome aboard and who only received a cold glance. Jordan had received that cold glance, then the slap, then being sent to the back with no explanation, and now justice was slowly making its return. Outside the plane's body, the sky remained clear. But inside, in this pressurized metal shell, a quiet purification was taking place. No anger, no shouting, just truth being revealed. And this time, everyone was watching. The cabin lights dimmed as the crew prepared for the next round of service. The aisles, once filled with idle chatter, now fell into an uncanny silence. People still talked, but not about the destination, the food, or the in-flight movie. Every conversation seemed to revolve around the young man in seat 2A. And the flight attendant who had disappeared even before the flight had truly begun. Jordan stretched his legs, leaning his head against the window's fabric. He wasn't tired, but pretending to be might make the curious glances soften. Still he could feel it, the furtive looks, the glances that lasted a second longer than usual before quickly turning away. Everyone on the plane had seen Jordan Ellis return to first class. They also saw Diane Carter quietly escort him back to his seat as if he were a child punished unfairly and sent back to class. And when time passed and she still hadn't returned to the plane, the truth became even clearer. Jordan held his phone. Another message from his father, Samuel Ellis. The internal email has been sent to the entire crew. The airline is reviewing her entire personnel file. A public statement will be issued in a few hours. The matter is now officially under investigation. Immediately after another line appeared, "You're trending. I'll try to manage it." Jordan sighed. He stared at the screen without replying. He didn't want to be famous. He had never sought the spotlight. Since he was young, his father always reminded him, "Power comes with attention, and sometimes you can't avoid it." Jordan once thought that by dressing, simply traveling alone, staying silent, he could avoid being noticed. But now he understood for some people they don't need to know your name to decide whether you belong or not. A quick glance was enough for them to judge. Across the cabin, two women leaned toward each other, whispering, "Is that him?" "Yeah, definitely." "Do you think he'll sue? If it were me, I would." They weren't malicious, just curious, but Jordan could hear every word, and they weighed on him like stones. He took a sip of water and put the phone face down on the tray table as if trying to shut out the world outside. No more notifications, no more updates. The man in the gray blazer, the one who had apologized earlier, turned toward Jordan again. "You know," he spoke quietly, "I work in corporate training. We talk about bias all the time. But when it happens right in front of you, everything's different." Jordan looked at him. His gaze, not cold, simply listening. "Experiencing it firsthand is always different," Jordan replied. The man nodded slowly. "I never thought I'd be the one to remain silent when it happened." Jordan spoke softly. "You're not the only one." A brief silence passed, but that doesn't make it an excuse. He added, "No, it never does," Jordan responded. And just like that, the conversation ended. At the back of the cabin, Maya Reynolds was reading the latest update on her tablet. Her hand tightened slightly as she saw the directive from the higher-ups. All crew members are required to review anti-discrimination policies. A mandatory training session will be scheduled. Any behavior related to passenger handling must be recorded and reported immediately. Beneath it was a private message from her supervisor. "Keep an eye on first-class report. Any abnormalities immediately." Maya sighed and set the device down. Nothing had escalated. But one thing was certain: everything had changed. The balance of power in the cabin was no longer what it once was. She walked slowly toward the front of the plane. Her gaze swept over the passengers. Some were fidgeting, others looked tired, some were staring into space. Then she saw Jordan. He was scrolling through his phone, his face expressionless, every movement slow and deliberate. Maya bent down just enough so no one else could hear. "I just want you to know, people are still talking about it, but not the way you think." Jordan looked up, waiting for her to continue. "No one doubts what happened," she said. "They're asking why they didn't see it sooner, why it took this long for someone to speak up." Jordan blinked. "Most of them thought you just let it go," she added. "But you didn't." Jordan didn't respond. But Maya saw something in his eyes, a depth not of pride, not of anger, just determination. She straightened up, nodded lightly, and walked away. The plane continued its journey through the high skies, the engines hummed steady. But the silence now didn't come from the altitude. It was the silence after a collision, when everyone began to realize that the consequences were coming. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood this flight was no longer an ordinary flight. It had become a warning, and no one would forget it easily. Everyone on the plane had seen Jordan Ellis return to first class. They had also seen Diane Carter quietly escort him back to his seat as if he were a student unjustly punished and now called back to class. And as time passed and she still hadn't returned to the plane, the truth became even clearer. Jordan held his phone. Another message from his father, Samuel Ellis. An internal email has been sent to the entire crew. The airline is reviewing her entire personnel file. A public statement will be issued in a few hours. The matter is now officially under investigation. Immediately after another line appeared, "You're trending. I'll try to manage it." Jordan sighed. He stared at the screen without replying. He didn't want to be famous. He had never sought the spotlight. Since he was young, his father always reminded him, "Power comes with attention, and sometimes you can't avoid it." Jordan once thought that by dressing, simply traveling alone, staying silent, he could avoid being noticed. But now he understood for some people they don't need to know your name to decide whether you belong or not. A quick glance was enough for them to judge. Across the cabin, two women leaned toward each other, whispering, "Is that him?" "Yeah, definitely. Do you think he'll sue? If it were me, I would." They weren't malicious, just curious. But Jordan could hear every word, and they weighed on him like stones. He took a sip of water and put the phone face down on the tray table as if trying to shut out the world outside. No more notifications. No more updates. The man in the gray blazer, the one who had apologized earlier, turned toward Jordan again. "You know," he spoke quietly, "I work in corporate training. We talk about bias all the time. But when it happens right in front of you, everything's different." Jordan looked at him, his gaze not cold, simply listening. "Experiencing it firsthand is always different," Jordan replied. The man nodded slowly. "I never thought I'd be the one to remain silent when it happened." Jordan spoke softly. "You're not the only one." A brief silence passed. "But that doesn't make it an excuse," he added. "No, it never does." Jordan responded. And, just like that, the conversation ended. At the back of the cabin, Maya Reynolds was reading the latest update on her tablet. Her hand tightened slightly as she saw the directive from the higher-ups. All crew members are required to review anti-discrimination policies. A mandatory training session will be scheduled. Any behavior related to passenger handling must be recorded and reported immediately. Beneath it was a private message from her supervisor. "Keep an eye on first class. Report any abnormalities immediately." Maya sighed and set the device down. Nothing had escalated, but one thing was certain: everything had changed. The balance of power in the cabin was no longer what it once was. She walked slowly toward the front of the plane. Her gaze swept over the passengers. Some were fidgeting, others looked tired. Some were staring into space. Then she saw Jordan. He was scrolling through his phone, his face expressionless, every movement slow and deliberate. Maya bent down just enough so no one else could hear. "I just want you to know. People are still talking about it, but not the way you think." Jordan looked up, waiting for her to continue. "No one doubts what happened," she said. "They're asking why they didn't see it sooner, why it took this long for someone to speak up." Jordan blinked. "Most of them thought you just let it go." She added, "But you didn't." Jordan didn't respond, but Maya saw something in his eyes, a depth not of pride, not of anger, just determination. She straightened up, nodded lightly, and walked away. The plane continued its journey through the high skies, the engines hummed steady. But the silence now didn't come from the altitude. It was the silence after a collision, when everyone began to realize that the consequences were coming. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood this flight was no longer an ordinary flight. It had become a warning, and no one would forget it easily. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent. Please fasten your seatbelts, stow your tray tables, and ensure your luggage is secured. We will land on time." "Thank you." A small ting rang out. Everyone heard it. But what lingered was something else. As if the first chapter was about to close, but the last page was still being written. Jordan tightened his seatbelt, his hands still. His body was accustomed to the motion, but his mind was elsewhere. Not in the sky, not on the ground, but in a place where the door was about to open for him, a place where the truth needed to keep going, not left behind on the plane. In the row ahead, a mother leaned down and whispered to her young daughter sitting beside her. Do you know sometimes people treat others poorly just because they don't look like them, and if no one speaks up, things only get worse. But that boy, he didn't stay silent. The girl around 10 years old looked up over her mother's shoulder toward Jordan Ellis. Her round eyes were quiet. Jordan caught her gaze and nodded slightly. A simple nod, but enough to say, "It's enough to be seen." In the galley, Maya Reynolds adjusted her collar and uniform belt. The plane was about to land, but her mind still lingered on the moment Diane Carter stepped off the plane, where silence erupted into change. She had flown over 60 flights this year, but this one would stay with her forever. A ding sounded. The captain made the final announcement. The flight attendants moved with precision, their actions as accurate as usual. But this time, the atmosphere around them felt as though someone was watching every move they made. Jordan still sat unmoving. His phone buzzed softly. A message from his father, Samuel Ellis. Security and the PR team are at the gate. Everything is being handled. They'll wait if you're ready. No cameras, as you requested. Jordan typed a short reply. Let them wait. I'll leave when the last person disembarks. He wanted to see them, the ones who had looked, the ones who had stayed silent, and even those who turned away. Not to punish them, but to remind them, presence has weight. The plane touched down softly. The brakes squealed lightly, and the engines gradually quieted. A few passengers clapped reflexively, but quickly stopped. The atmosphere no longer suited the usual celebration. Jordan stared straight ahead. The woman in the white blouse next to him pulled out her phone, opened the Notes app, and began typing. He didn't need to read it, didn't need to know, because he had said everything without saying a word. At the back, passengers began to stand, but they didn't rush out as usual. They moved more slowly, more cautiously, as if they were all waiting for something bigger than just a safe landing. One by one, people passed by seat 2A. A few nodded, others quietly turned away. Some whispered, "Thank you." Jordan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The line of passengers continued until the cabin was completely empty. No more footsteps, no more rolling suitcases, nothing but silence. Jordan remained seated. His hands rested on his thighs, back straight, his gaze calm, no unnecessary movements, no signs of fatigue. He didn't avoid it. He didn't need to rush off. And with each second he sat there, it carried a message. I have nothing to hide. I have the right to be here, just like anyone else. A few steps away, Maya Reynolds stood near the cockpit door, watching him. Since boarding this flight, everything had changed for her. She was no longer the flight attendant following a script. She had become the witness. And for the first time, she understood the real responsibility of the crew. Not just safety, but standing on the right side when the truth is revealed. Jordan looked at her. A slight nod. She nodded back. That's all enough to understand each other. The plane door opened with a soft hiss. 3 people stepped in, a man in a black coat, a young woman holding a clipboard, and a third person in a gray suit with a badge on his chest. They moved slowly, cautiously, as if they were stepping into a space that didn't belong to them. The man in the black coat stepped forward. Jordan Ellis, I'm Mark Sullivan from the External Relations Department. First, I want to say there's no excuse for what happened. Jordan looked at him but didn't say anything. Mark continued choosing each word carefully. The flight attendant involved has been suspended indefinitely. An internal investigation is underway. We will issue an official apology to the public. We will also review the entire training program and conduct procedures. Not just because of this incident, but because it should have been done long ago. The woman standing beside him added, We understand if you don't want to speak publicly, but if you choose to, We'll support any message you wish to convey." Jordan Ellis looked directly at the three people standing before him. They were well-dressed, speaking carefully. They might have been sincere, but their caution was obvious. They were here to quell the crisis, and he understood that. But what he saw most clearly was the shame, not because they had done something wrong today, but because they had turned a blind eye for far too long. Finally, Jordan spoke, his voice steady and deep. "I don't need to become a headline." Mark Sullivan was about to respond, but Jordan cut him off. "But I want change, not just a press release, not just firing someone. I want every staff member in your uniforms to understand what it feels like to be treated as if you don't belong here. I want what you promised retraining to actually mean something, not just a procedure to make it look like you're doing something." Jordan looked them straight in the eye. "And I want you to say that not just to me, but to all the people who witnessed and said nothing, because silence is the loudest noise on this flight." No one said anything. Jordan slowly stood up, grabbed his backpack, and slung it over his shoulder. The leather strap made a soft creak under his firm grip. He looked around the cabin one last time, the place where silence, collapse, and awakening had all been witnessed. "This was never just about me," he said. "It's about the people who've been pushed to the back just because they didn't fit someone else's image, the ones who don't have a power call to rely on Mark Sullivan." Nodded lightly, swallowing his unfinished words. Jordan nodded back, stepping past them. Maya Reynolds stood off to the side, her eyes following him. Before stepping out of the plane door, Jordan paused for a moment, turned to her, and said, "You don't say much, but you saw it, and that is enough." Then he walked away, stepping into the corridor, embracing the first light of dawn. No cameras, no applause, only the weight of silence in a story that would live longer than any seat boarding pass or class of service. Inside the cabin, the silence remained, but it was no longer emptiness. It was the space that held everything that had been said, and everything no one could ever forget, because there are flights that take people farther than any destination printed on a ticket, and there are passengers, after standing once, who will never be ignored again. You have just followed a journey that is not only about a flight, but a powerful reminder that silence holds strength. That calmness when standing in the face of injustice can shake an entire system. Jordan Ellis didn't shout. He didn't need to make noise. He simply sat still and let the truth speak for itself. If this story made you think, if it stirred something within you, then share it. Maybe somewhere, someone else needs to hear this hit. Like if you believe that respect should be given to all, regardless of race or seat. Share it if you want to help spread awareness, and subscribe so you won't miss more stories that touch the heart, like this one. 'Cause here we don't just tell stories, we retell humanity. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. See you in the next story, where the truth always deserves a seat at the table.